Should Christians observe the Sabbath today? Who changed Sabbath observance, God or man? What does the Bible teach about the Sabbath anyway? Stay tuned for this fascinating Bible study.
The Churches of Christ of the North Texas area present The Truth in Love.
How precious is the good divine, by inspiration give. Bright as the lamp its precept shine, to guide my soul to heaven. Holy Bark divine, precious treasure mine, lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home. This lamp through all the tedious night of life shall guide my way, till I behold the clearer light of an eternal day. Holy Bark divine, precious treasure thine, lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home.
Good morning. I'm David Roper, the preacher for the Brown Trail Church of Christ, and your host for The Truth in Love. We appreciate so much the response we receive from those of you that watch. During the past 10 months, we've especially received a lot of response in connection with the biblical teaching on the covenants in general and the Sabbath in particular. So we thought you might enjoy a program just on the Sabbath. To guide our study today, we have 4 of the teachers from the Brown Trail School of Preaching: Rusty Peterman, Dick Stanyo, James Wilcutt, and Don Simpson. It's good, of course, to have each one of you with us, and we hope God will be with you during this presentation. I know you have a lot to say, so we're going to get started immediately. We're going to start with Mr. Peterman, go Mr. Stanyo, Mr. Wilcutt, Mr. Simpson. After you finish, if time permits, perhaps we can come back and discuss some of the points you make. Mr. Peterman?
Thank you, David. When you study the life of Christ, you'll find that on several occasions he encountered the religious leaders of his day in a discussion concerning the Sabbath and its proper observance. It becomes clear through a study of these Sabbath day controversies that among religious people in that first century there was misunderstandings with regard to the Sabbath. And I think that the same could be said today. There is still much misunderstanding in the religious world concerning this institution called the Sabbath. I think that most of the misunderstanding could be corrected if we would study the Scriptures, and especially if we would look at 3 important questions. Why was the Sabbath given? To whom was it given? And is the Sabbath binding on modern man? Now, why was the Sabbath given? There are 2 classic statements concerning the Sabbath law in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, and we also have Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning verse 12 through verse 15. Through a study of these 2 passages, we learn that the Sabbath day was the 7th day of the week. We learn that it was a day that was to be kept holy. We furthermore learn that it was a day on which work was to cease. 6 days were made for work, but man was to cease that work on the 7th day. These passages also reveal something about why this was to be a special day. For instance, in Exodus chapter 20, beginning verse 11, we read, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and hallowed it." The Lord rested, or He ceased from His creative work on the 7th day. And so He called upon Israel to observe this day as a memorial each week to remember God's work as Creator. Then in Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning in verse 15, we learn an additional reason why the Sabbath was to be a special day in Israel. "And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day." Here another reason enters the picture for keeping the Sabbath. In addition to it being a memorial to remember God's creative work, it was also to be a memorial to remember God as deliverer. And so to summarize, we would say that the Sabbath was given to Israel so that they would never forget God as their Creator and God as their deliverer. Now the second question, to whom was the Sabbath given? Both of these commands that we've referred to were addressed specifically to Israel. And yet there are some today who would suggest that the Sabbath was given to all people for all time. But let's listen carefully to what it says in Exodus chapter 31, beginning verse 12. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, and you may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. And there are two words that I would point our attention to. The word sign, the word sanctify. The Sabbath was a sign between God and Israel. Question: if the Sabbath was given to every other nation and to all other people, how could it constitute a special sign to Israel? We learn also here that the Sabbath was designed to let the children of Israel know that the Lord had sanctified them, had set them apart from all the other nations of the earth. The question would follow then, how could the Sabbath demonstrate that Israel had been set apart, that they had been sanctified, if every other nation was also observing the Sabbath by divine command? I think we'll see that the Bible does teach that the Sabbath was given only to the people of Israel. Now, is this command, though, binding upon modern man? Well, for this, let's turn to the New Testament, specifically Colossians chapter 2, beginning verse 14. There the Apostle Paul says, the old ordinances, the old law of which the Sabbath law was a part, was nailed to the cross. And then in verse 16 he makes a specific application of this command. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of a new moon or of the Sabbath. It is not binding on modern man.
My specific topic for this discussion is the covenants, and specifically to determine whether or not the Old Covenant, the Old Testament law, is binding upon man today. It's unfortunate, I think, that in discussions of this sort, both those who are pro and con use the terminology ceremonial and moral law. These terms are not found at all in the Old Testament, nor are they found in the Bible as a whole. It's quite misleading to use terminology that's not represented in God's Word. Now, Sabbatarians argue in favor of the Old Covenant being binding that there's a distinction to be made between the law of God on the one hand and the law of Moses on the other. They argue that the law of Moses is ceremonial, and indeed it was abolished. On the other hand, they argue the law of God, as represented most perfectly, they believe, in the Ten Commandments, the law of God is still in force today and is to be observed by every person who wants to be right with God. Now, how shall we respond to this supposed distinction that's made? Well, first of all, it's interesting to observe that in the over 400 occurrences of the word law in the Old Testament, not one time does it refer to the Ten Commandments alone, nor does it mention the term ceremonial or moral law. The distinction is somewhat arbitrary. For further representation of this truth, we turn to the 8th chapter of Nehemiah. There the terms are used interchangeably. For instance, in verse 1, we have the book of the law of Moses. In verse 2, we read concerning the law. In verse 3, the book of the law. And in verse 8, the law of God. Now, these terms are not used as distinct terms, but are interchangeable terms. God gave the book of the law according to Nehemiah 8, verse 1. He also gave Moses' law according to Ezra 7, verse 6. But Moses gave the law, John 1:17. Moses also gave the law of the Lord, 2 Chronicles 34, verse 14. Moses also gave God's law in Nehemiah 10:29. The distinction that's drawn between these two terms, law of God and law of Moses, is non-existent in the Bible. Secondly, I would turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and read there just two verses, verses 7 and 11, and then make some important arguments on those two passages. Verse 7 reads, "But if the ministration of death written and engraven in stones was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away." Now verse 11, "For if that which is done away was glorious, much more that which remaineth is glorious." Argument number one, that which was done away was glorious, verse 11. But that which was done away was written and engraven in stones, verse 7. Therefore, that which was done away was written and engraven in stones. Argument number two, that which was written and engraven in stones was given when Moses' face shone, verses 7 and 13. But that which was given when Moses' face shone was the Ten Commandments. That's Exodus 34, verses 27 through 29. Therefore, that which was written and engraven in stones was the Ten Commandments. Now we use the conclusions for both those arguments as premises in our final argument, argument 3. That which was done away was written and engraven in stones, but that which was written and engraven in stones was the Ten Commandments. Therefore, that which was done away was the Ten Commandments. There's simply no way that anyone, Sabbatarian or otherwise, can deal with that very simple argument, that series of arguments made on 2 Corinthians 3. In addition, Romans 7 verses 6 and 7 clearly state that we are discharged or delivered from the law. Verse 7 identifies that law by stating one of the precepts of it, "Thou shalt not covet." That had specific reference to the Ten Commandment covenant. Paul says we are delivered or discharged from that law. It is clearly the case that no man living today, not even a Jew, is bound by the Ten Commandments, the Old Testament law given exclusively to Israel. It is therefore the case that the Old Covenant is no longer binding on man today. We are instead bound by the words of Jesus as represented in the New Testament, the New Covenant of Jesus Christ.
We appreciate so very much the background information which has been given, and I think if we had listened carefully, we would have seen therein the answer to our question on who changed the Sabbath law. I think one of the most important things for all of us to recognize at this particular time is throughout the history of God's dealings with man, He has had a special day of worship, devotion, and praise and adoration unto Him. There is and there has been a special day of significance in worship of Jehovah God. As has already been pointed out, for the Jewish nation, this day was the Sabbath day, or the seventh day, generally termed today Saturday. Now for the Christian dispensation, for the Christian age, with the new covenant came a new law, the law of Christ, in counter-distinction to the law of Moses. In addition to that, there came a new name, the name of Christ, or the name of Christian. And in addition to that, there came a new day of worship. This day was divinely originated, the first day of the week. It was spoken of as well and authorized by the apostles of Christ, as we have record in the Word of God. But again, I want to emphasize for us today, there is a special day. There is a day that needs to be devoted and dedicated unto God. There is a special day of assembly, and there is a special day of worship. I think it's important for all people to know that and to understand that, because for so many today, the first day of the week just becomes another day. And for so many, all days are the same. And for so many, there is no significant religious day or special day. I want to call your attention to Acts 20 and verse 7, which says, "And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech till midnight." This was a special day of fellowship, of worship, of assembling together for the purpose of partaking of the Lord's Supper and remembering Christ, who rose from the dead upon the first day of the week. Now we need today as well to recognize the divine nature apostolically authorized nature of the first day of the week as a day of worship, praise, adoration, and devotion unto Jehovah God. We need to meet upon the first day of every week, as is authorized in Acts 20 and verse 7, for the purpose of partaking of the Lord's Supper in remembrance of Christ. So from Acts, the 2nd chapter, we learn that breaking of the loaf is a stated part of the worship. From Acts, the 20th chapter, we learn that Christians met upon the first day of the week in order to worship God and partake of the Lord's Supper. Also, we recognize from 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2, that they came together upon the first day of every week. And on this occasion, it was for the laying by in store as God had prospered them. Again, in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 20, it mentions that when ye come together in one place, is it not to eat the Lord's Supper? So the early Christians met together upon the designated day of the week, the first day of the week, commonly known today as Sunday, in order to worship God. People still should assemble in reverence of God upon the first day of the week in order to worship Him and in spirit and in truth. Another thing that indicates to us that God gave and authorized the first day of the week is that there's no authorization for New Testament Christians to meet upon the seventh day to worship God. But as we've mentioned in these passages, Christians are authorized to meet upon the first day of the week. Certainly Constantine did not give us the first day of the week just because he recognized that Christians met and assembled upon this day and made that a national holiday for the Roman people. So concerning this, I want to make these observations. There is a special day for worship for Christians. Acts 20 and 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. That day is the first day of the week, or Sunday. That we should respect that day, worship on that day, and partake of the supper of the Lord on that day. And that this special designated day is of divine origin. Thank you.
Thank you. We need to realize that there are a number of religious groups today who are Sabbatarian. Now that does not say that all of these religious groups necessarily agree with each other in all areas of doctrine. However, there are certain objections which they do have in common, and these are the objections to which I would like to address. Now those of us who honor the first day of the week as the day that Christ was raised from the dead, and as the day that we are to worship today, turn to Acts 20 and verse 7 as a Bible basis. Now certainly Acts 20 and verse 7 as well as 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2 are instances of apostolic sanction. However, it is difficult to get the Sabbatarians to acknowledge that. But now turning to Acts the 20th chapter in verse 7, it says, "And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. And there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were gathered together." Now we find that Paul and his companions, including Luke, are in Troas. They have been there for 7 days. It is now time for the first day of the week, and upon that day they come together to break bread. Now there have been objections made that this eating of this bread is not the Lord's Supper, rather that it was just a common meal. However, it is interesting that in one of the old treatises in the 1st and 2nd century called the Didache, which was the teaching of the 12, uses the same language in the Greek that Luke uses here and applies it to the Lord's Supper, as well as referring to it as occurring on the Lord's Day. So at least we do have some testimony outside the sacred Scriptures. Of course, this is not an inspired writing, but at least some evidence there that this is the Lord's Supper. Now, many Sabbatarians have objected, saying that the assembling here in Acts 20 and verse 7 did not occur upon the first day of the week. Rather, it occurred upon the Sabbath because the Jewish day began at 6 o'clock in the evening and continued on. Therefore, they came together on the Sabbath and not the first day of the week. However, consider the city of Troas, which was a Roman city. they probably and more than likely would have used Roman time rather than Jewish time, considering the fact that it was strictly a Roman city, and also the fact that they did not pay land tax, which would indicate that it was an Italian city. Chances of observing Jewish time is very remote. Now, I am aware that the New English Bible interprets this as on the Saturday night. But we need to realize that this is an interpretation and not a translation, because there is a lot of difference between that. Another objection that has been made by many Sabbatarians today is that Paul worshiped in the synagogue every Sabbath. There is no evidence in the Scriptures that Paul worshiped in the synagogue every Sabbath. Now, he did go into the synagogue from time to time, but these were not his brethren in Christ. These people did not believe in the resurrection of Jesus. They did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They did not recognize the virgin birth of Jesus. These were not his brethren, and he did not go into the synagogue to worship. Rather, he went into the synagogue because that's where the people were, the Jewish people, and it gave him an opportunity to teach. We know, of course, in Acts 17 that he went to the Areopagus in Athens, but did he go there to worship? Of course not. Did Paul go into the synagogue every Sabbath? Not every Sabbath. We know that he entered into the synagogue from time to time. For example, in Ephesus, there were a number of months that he did go into the synagogue. But certainly came the time in which he was cast out. He no longer went into the synagogue, and he taught in the school of Tyrannus. There are other objections that have been made, and I see that my time is running out, so I believe I'll turn it back over to David Roper. Thank you.
We appreciate all that's been said to this point. There are, of course, many objections that are made, many arguments that are made, and we have just a little time, and I want to throw these out just briefly, and anybody would like to respond to them, if you'll just indicate that. As I speak to individuals or write to them or correspond with them, about the most common thing that's said is, well, after all, Jesus observed the Sabbath. Now, I think we've touched on that and really handled that, but someone would like to just respond specifically to that. Well, Jesus always kept the Sabbath.
Let me first respond to that, David. That is, of course, true. Jesus was made under the law, born of woman, made under the law, according to Galatians 4 and verse 4. The book of Galatians really is a treatise in covenant theology, dealing with the distinction between the Old Testament law and the New Testament law. Jesus lived under Mosaic law and kept that law, and obviously part of that law was, of course, to observe the Sabbath. But now in Hebrews chapter 9, beginning at verse 16, the record says, where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead, otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. The new covenant obviously could not have been brought into being, the New Testament, the will of Jesus Christ, until after Jesus had died. And after Jesus had died and probated the new covenant given in the Great Commission, then that new law went into effect. That new law did not make allowance nor give authority for the Sabbath.
Another thing that's very constantly said to me in this connection is that the Bible continues right through the New Testament to put stress on the law. And we've got to keep law. And if anybody doesn't keep law, then, dire consequences are going to come. And always, in the minds of many people, anytime it says the law, it means the Ten Commandments. Would anybody like to respond to that? Rusty?
Well, throughout human history, God has always given to man instructions by which to live. The old law, the law that was given to Israel, was a means of their keeping their covenant with Him. It was a blessing to them so that they would know how that they were to respond to His love and be well-pleasing to Him. Law is something that has always been given to man, and in the New Testament we have the law of Christ, a law that's designed to help all men everywhere come to understand how to be pleasing to God, how to live with one another and be a blessing both to man and to God.
Thank you. Well, we wish you had more time. Our time is gone. Our sincere Thanks to Rusty Peterman, Dick Stanyo, James Wilcutt, and Don Simpson for being with us and for sharing these thoughts with us. We hope the presentation has been beneficial to you. If you'd like to study this question further, we have a free booklet entitled, Is the Sabbath Binding Today? When you write to us, request the Sabbath booklet. We'll be back with a closing word right after the song.
Life is more than what you have, more than food or clothes or gold. Will greed rule your life each day? Look to God for strength to hold. Be not anxious for your life. Do not worry for your bread. He will feed your soul each day if you trust what God has said. Have you thought of how the birds neither sow nor reap nor store, yet the Father will feed them? Does our God not love you more? Be not anxious for your life. Do not worry for your bread. He will feed your soul each day if you trust what God has said. Have you thought about the flowers, how they neither toil nor spin, yet the Father clothes them well? You must build your faith in Him. Be not anxious for your life. Do not worry for your bread. He will feed your soul each day if you trust what God has said. Be not anxious for your life. Do not worry for your bread. He will feed your soul each day if you trust what God has said.
Before we close today, I want to tell you about a special series coming in just 2 weeks. Lord willing, on May 13th, Robert Bankus will begin a 3-week study on the home as God would have it. We have free study booklets so that you can study right along with Mr. Bankus in your own home. Just ask for the study booklet on the home when you write to us. Ask for the Sabbath booklet and the study booklet on the home. Today we need homes patterned after God's blueprint more than ever before. Tell your friends about this special series. You'll be doing them a great favor. We appreciate your watching us from week to week, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. May God bless you very richly.
This has been The Truth in Love, sponsored by the Churches of Christ of the North Texas area. For a copy of today's program, additional information, or Bible correspondence course at no charge to you, please write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. Once again, write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. We invite you to attend the Church of Christ in your area. Join us again next Sunday at the same time for The Truth in Love.